The clock had just struck 9:30 p.m. when Special Agent Regina Martinez let out a tired sigh, gathering her things from her desk at the FBI headquarters. It had been another long day of back-to-back meetings, the kind that came with her recent promotion to Chief of the Civil Rights Division. She hadn't even had time for lunch, just coffee and a granola bar between briefings about ongoing cases. The parking garage was nearly empty as her footsteps echoed against the concrete. She slid into her modest sedan. Nothing flashy, just reliable transportation that helped her blend in. The radio played softly in the background as she headed home, thinking about the stack of case files she brought to review over the weekend. The streets were quiet in this part of town, lined with old oak trees and well-kept houses. She was only 10 minutes from home when she noticed the police cruiser that had been following her for the last few blocks. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Regina checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. Years of law enforcement experience told her something wasn't right about this stop. She pulled over properly, turning on her interior lights and placing her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Standard procedure she'd taught countless times at the academy. The cruiser door slammed harder than necessary, and she watched in her side mirror as Officer James Barrett approached, his hand already resting on his weapon. That was the first red flag. License and registration. He barked before even reaching her window, his flashlight beam uncomfortably bright in her eyes. His tone was aggressive, nothing like the professional courtesy she was used to between law enforcement officers. "Good evening, officer," Regina replied calmly, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my credentials now." She carefully pulled out her FBI badge and ID, holding them up where the light could clearly show both her photo and federal law enforcement status. Barrett's response was immediate and concerning. "I don't care what kind of fake ID you've got there. I said license and registration." His voice had risen, and he'd shifted his stance to a more aggressive posture. Regina felt her heart rate increase, not from fear, but from the recognition of what was happening. She'd investigated too many similar incidents in her career not to recognize the signs. "Officer Barrett," she said, reading his nameplate, "I'm Special Agent Regina Martinez, FBI Chief of Civil Rights. I'm going to reach for my phone now to call your supervisor. Get out of the car. Now." Barrett's voice cracked with anger as he suddenly reached for her door handle. Regina stayed perfectly still, her right hand moving slowly to activate the recording function on her phone. Another habit from years of field work. A car drove past slowly, its headlights illuminating the scene. In that brief flash of light, Regina caught sight of Barrett's face, red with anger, but there was something else there too. Something that told her the situation was about to get much worse before it got better. She'd spent her career dealing with complex situations, but this one was different. This wasn't just about her badge or her position. As she watched Barrett radio for backup, using code phrases that suggested a combative suspect rather than a federal agent, she knew she was facing something far more personal and systemic. The next few moments would require every bit of her training, experience, and self-control. As more lights appeared in her rearview mirror, Regina took a deep breath. She hadn't become the FBI's civil rights chief by backing down from difficult situations. But she also knew that what happened next would have implications far beyond this one traffic stop on a quiet suburban street. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as two more police cars pulled up behind Officer Barrett's cruiser. Regina's phone continued recording, capturing every word as Barrett paced beside her car, his boots scraping against the asphalt with each aggressive step. She could see the neighbors' curtains twitching. This quiet street wasn't used to such commotion at this hour. "I've got an uncooperative suspect," Barrett spat into his radio, completely ignoring the FBI credentials still displayed in Regina's steady hands. Refusing to comply with basic commands. His words were calculated, building a narrative that didn't match reality, and Regina recognized the tactic from countless case files she'd reviewed. Through her open window, she could hear the soft whir of security cameras from the house across the street. Mrs. Chen, the retired teacher who lived there, had installed them after a series of car break-ins last summer. Now those same cameras were silently documenting everything unfolding in front of her house. "Officer," Regina spoke again, her voice clear and professional. "I want to be very clear about what's happening here. I am a federal agent, and you are currently interfering with a federal officer in the performance of their duties." She kept her tone even, though her grip tightened slightly on her phone as Barrett's face contorted with anger. "Listen here." He leaned into her window, his breath fogging the glass. "I don't care if you claim to be the Queen of England. In my jurisdiction, you do what I say when I say it." The veins in his neck stood out as he spoke, his words carrying an undercurrent of something darker than just professional authority. A young couple walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk slowed down, the husband already pulling out his phone to record. Barrett noticed them too, but instead of tempering his behavior, it seemed to fuel his anger. "This is a police matter." He shouted at them. "Keep moving." The backup officers finally approached, their footsteps hesitant as they took in the scene. Regina could read the uncertainty in their body language. They'd clearly been expecting something very different from what they found. One of them, Officer Thompson, according to her nameplate, did a double take at Regina's credentials. "Chief Martinez?" Thompson's voice carried a note of recognition. "I attended your lecture at the Academy last month on community policing." The shift in her tone was immediate, but Barrett cut her off before she could say more. "She's presenting false credentials," Barrett insisted, his voice rising higher. "This is obviously a fake ID. Look at it." But even as he spoke, Regina could see the doubt creeping into the faces of his fellow officers. Thompson had pulled out her phone, likely checking Regina's credentials against the federal database. The security lights from nearby houses illuminated the scene like a stage, creating a strange theatrical quality to the mounting tension. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of sirens. More backup responding to Barrett's increasingly agitated radio calls. Regina watched in her side mirror as Thompson tried to speak quietly to Barrett, suggesting they step back and verify credentials properly. But Barrett was too far gone, too invested in his original assumption to back down now. His hand kept twitching toward his weapon, a movement that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. The young couple with the dog had stopped completely now, joined by other neighbors who'd been drawn out by the commotion. Their presence formed a silent witness to what was unfolding, their phones capturing every word, every gesture, every escalation of Barrett's increasingly erratic behavior. Regina knew the next few moments would be crucial. She could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Barrett's authority crumbling in real time as his backup realized their mistake, but his anger and pride pushing him toward a decision that could change lives forever. She'd seen this pattern before in cases she'd investigated, but experiencing it firsthand brought a whole new dimension to the crisis. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Barrett's face twisted with a decision that would change everyone's lives. The gathered crowd held their collective breath, dozens of phone cameras capturing the moment. Regina's FBI training kicked in as she noticed Barrett's stance shift. She'd seen that movement hundreds of times in training scenarios. "I said get out of the car." Barrett's voice cracked as he suddenly grabbed her car door handle, yanking it with enough force to shake the entire vehicle. Regina's heart pounded, but her mind remained clear. Years of experience told her exactly what she needed to do. "Officer Barrett," she said one final time, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. "I am Special Agent Regina Martinez, FBI Chief of Civil Rights. Remove your hand from my vehicle immediately." She spoke each word with crystal clarity, knowing the importance of having everything on record. But Barrett was beyond listening. In his mind, he'd gone too far to back down now. The small crowd of neighbors gasped as he reached through the window, attempting to unlock the door. His backup officers rushed forward, finally realizing how dangerous the situation had become. Regina moved with the smooth precision of someone who trained for exactly this kind of scenario. As Barrett's arm came through her window, she carefully but firmly deflected it while simultaneously opening her door from the inside. The motion caught Barrett off balance, forcing him to step back. "She's resisting," Barrett shouted, but his words rang hollow as Regina stepped out of her car with perfect composure, her FBI badge gleaming under the streetlights. She kept her movements deliberate and non-threatening, yet her presence commanded attention from everyone present. Officer Thompson had her hand on Barrett's shoulder now, trying to pull him back. "Stand down," Thompson urged, her voice urgent. "Those are real federal credentials." But Barrett shrugged her off, his face red with a mix of anger and growing realization that he'd made a terrible mistake. The neighbors' phones captured everything. Regina's professional demeanor, Barrett's increasingly erratic behavior, and the mounting tension in the air. Mrs. Chen had come out onto her porch, her security cameras providing yet another angle of the unfolding scene. "Last warning," Regina stated firmly as Barrett took another step toward her. "Your actions are being recorded from multiple angles. Think very carefully about your next move." Her words carried no threat, just a calm statement of fact that seemed to finally penetrate Barrett's anger. But like a cornered animal, Barrett made one final, desperate move. He lunged forward, reaching for Regina's arm. In that split second, Regina's decades of training took over. With movements that looked almost gentle to the watching crowd, she sidestepped his grab while using his own momentum to guide him away from her. Barrett stumbled, his balance thrown off by his own aggressive charge. Regina stayed perfectly positioned, her hands raised where everyone could see them, making it clear she was defending herself while using minimal force. The gathered crowd murmured in appreciation of her skilled response. Thompson and the other backup officers finally sprang into action, moving to secure Barrett, who now found himself facing a situation entirely different from what he imagined. His authority had crumbled in front of a growing crowd of witnesses, all their phones pointed at the scene. Regina stood calmly, her phone still recording in one hand, her FBI credentials clearly visible in the other. The street had fallen silent except for the sound of crickets and the soft whir of camera phones. In the distance, more sirens approached, likely senior officers responding to the escalating situation. The neighbors watched in amazement as Regina maintained her professional composure even as Barrett was being pulled back by his fellow officers. She'd managed to defuse a potentially deadly situation without anyone getting hurt, turning what could have been a tragedy into a powerful lesson of professionalism and proper law enforcement conduct. Red and blue lights painted the street like a disco as more police vehicles arrived at the scene. The night air buzzed with radio chatter and hushed conversations from the crowd of neighbors who'd gathered to witness the incident. A police lieutenant's car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the tension that still hung in the air. Regina stood perfectly composed, her credentials now being examined by the lieutenant, who had introduced himself with an apologetic tone. His face showed a mix of embarrassment and concern as he reviewed the situation. Behind him, Officer Barrett sat in the back of a police car, the fight completely drained from his posture. "Chief Martinez," the lieutenant said, handing back her credentials, "I can't begin to express how sorry we are about this incident." His words carried genuine regret, but Regina could see he was already thinking about the storm this would create for his department. Officer Thompson approached with a tablet, showing Regina the results of her credential check. "Everything's verified, ma'am. We've got multiple videos of the incident from different angles." She gestured to the neighbors, who were still recording everything on their phones. "Mrs. Chen across the street has already offered us her security camera footage." The crowd had grown larger, with people from several blocks away drawn by the commotion. Some were live streaming the scene, while others talked in hushed voices about what they'd witnessed. A few older residents nodded approvingly at how Regina had handled the situation, clearly impressed by her professionalism. "I'll need copies of all officer body camera footage," Regina said, her voice carrying the authority of her position. "And I want it noted that I'm formally reporting this as a civil rights violation." She spoke clearly enough for the gathering to hear, but without any hint of anger or revenge in her tone. The lieutenant nodded, already pulling out his phone to make calls. "We'll have internal affairs here within the hour. Would you like to give your statement now, or would you prefer to do this at the station?" His question was professional, but Regina could see the worry lines deepening on his forehead. Mrs. Chen had made her way through the crowd, clutching a tablet. "I have the video right here," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "I saw everything from my security cameras. The way he treated you." She trailed off, shaking her head in disapproval. Regina thanked her with a warm smile, noting how the elderly teacher's hands trembled as she showed her the footage. The crisp video would be crucial evidence, showing Barrett's aggressive behavior from the very beginning of the stop. Two young officers were taking statements from the witnesses, their pens scratching against notepads as people described what they'd seen. The couple with the dog stayed the longest, their own video capturing some of the clearest footage of Barrett's actions. "Chief Martinez," Officer Thompson said softly, stepping closer. "I just want you to know what you did tonight. How you handled this. It's exactly what you taught us in that lecture about professional conduct under pressure." Her words carried genuine admiration, and several other officers nodded in agreement. The lieutenant returned, looking grave. "Internal affairs is on their way. They're treating this as a priority case." He glanced at his watch, then back at Regina. "The press will probably get wind of this soon. Do you want us to arrange an escort home?" Regina shook her head, maintaining her dignified composure. "No, thank you. I'll provide my statement and drive myself home." She turned to look at Barrett in the police car, not with anger, but with determination. This incident would become more than just another case file. It would be a catalyst for real change. The neighbors slowly began to disperse, though many lingered to shake Regina's hand or express their support. As the scene began to clear, the true weight of what had happened settled over the street. This quiet suburban neighborhood had just witnessed something that would ripple through the entire law enforcement community. Early morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Internal Affairs conference room as Regina reviewed the stack of files in front of her. The investigation had been running for a week now, and what they'd uncovered went far deeper than one traffic stop gone wrong. "You need to see this," said Inspector Chen, sliding another folder across the table. She wasn't related to the Mrs. Chen who provided the security footage, just a coincidence that highlighted how small the world could be sometimes. The inspector's face was grim as Regina opened the folder. Inside were 5 previous complaints against Officer Barrett, all buried under layers of bureaucracy and friendly supervisors. Each case showed a similar pattern: aggressive behavior, questionable stops, and reports that somehow never made it through the system. The dates stretched back 3 years. How did these never come to light? Regina asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd seen this pattern too many times in her career, the thin blue line protecting its own, even when it shouldn't. The inspector sighed, pulling up more records on her laptop. His previous supervisor was Officer Kelly, retired now, but he had a reputation for making problems disappear. She turned the screen to show Regina a pattern of dismissed complaints and lost paperwork. The investigation room buzzed with activity as other officers worked through years of records. Video footage from the incident played silently on one wall. Mrs. Chen's security cameras, body cams, and dozens of cell phone videos all synchronized to show every angle of that night. "The good news," said Inspector Chen, "is that the younger officers are cooperating fully." She nodded toward Officer Thompson, who was giving her statement in another room. "They're tired of covering for the old guard. They want change." Regina watched through the glass as Thompson described not just the incident, but other times she'd seen Barrett's problematic behavior. The young officer's voice was clear and confident. She knew she was doing the right thing, even though it meant crossing that thin blue line. A knock at the door interrupted their review. The police chief himself had arrived, looking like he hadn't slept in days. The media coverage had been intense, with the video going viral and national news networks picking up the story. His department was under the microscope, and he knew it. "I've been going through personnel files myself," he said, dropping another stack of papers on the table. "Found some interesting connections. Barrett's former partner now works in records. Might explain why some complaints never made it to the right desk." Regina nodded, making notes. She wasn't interested in revenge or punishment for its own sake. Her goal was bigger, using this incident to push for real, lasting change in how departments handled these situations. The wall of monitors showed more footage, this time from Barrett's dash cam history over the past year. Pattern recognition software was flagging concerning interactions, building a timeline of escalating behavior that should have been caught long ago. "The community's response has been overwhelming," Inspector Chen mentioned, pulling up emails on her screen. "We've had dozens of people come forward with their own stories. Not just about Barrett, but about similar experiences they never reported because they thought nothing would be done." Regina stood up, stretching after hours of review. Looking at the evidence wall, covered in photos, timelines, and connected events, she could see the bigger picture emerging. This wasn't just about one officer losing control. It was about a system that had allowed it to happen. "What we do here matters," she said to the room of investigators. "Not just for this case, but for every department watching how we handle it." She picked up another file, ready to dive back in. The work was demanding, but she could feel the momentum building toward real change. Outside the investigation room, life went on. Officers patrolled their beats, dispatchers answered calls, and the daily work of law enforcement continued. But within these walls, a transformation was beginning, one that would ripple through departments across the country. The police department's training room buzzed with energy as officers filled every seat. 3 months had passed since the incident, and today it marked the launch of their new training program. Regina stood at the front, not as a victim of prejudice, but as a leader bringing positive change. "I see a lot of familiar faces," she began, smiling at Officer Thompson in the front row. "Some of you were there that night. Others have watched the videos. But today isn't about dwelling on what went wrong. It's about making sure we get it right going forward." The screen behind her displayed new department policies, but they weren't just rules written by distant administrators. These guidelines had been crafted with input from officers at every level, community members, and civil rights experts. Everyone had a voice in this change. "Last week, I sat down with a group of veteran officers," Regina continued, clicking to the next slide. "They shared some amazing insights about the pressures they face on the street. We've built those experiences into this training." Several older officers nodded, feeling heard rather than attacked. Officer Thompson raised her hand. "Chief Martinez, could you talk about the new partner rotation program?" Her question opened up a discussion about one of the most innovative changes, partnering younger officers with veterans from different backgrounds to share perspectives and experiences. In the back of the room, the police chief watched with quiet pride. His department was becoming a model for others, with police chiefs from neighboring cities already asking to send their officers through the program. What could have been a career-ending scandal had transformed into an opportunity for growth. "Let's run through a scenario," Regina said, pulling up body camera footage from a recent traffic stop. "Officer Chen, talk us through what you see." The young officer stood up, confidently analyzing how his colleague had handled a tense situation professionally, de-escalating what could have become a confrontation. During the lunch break, officers gathered in small groups, sharing stories and discussing the morning's training. The atmosphere was different from 3 months ago, more open, more willing to acknowledge mistakes and learn from them. Even the oldest veterans were engaging with the new ideas. You know what's really changed? One officer said to Regina as she got coffee. We're not afraid to speak up anymore when we see something wrong. That wall of silence, it was protecting the wrong people all along. The afternoon session focused on practical exercises. Officers paired up, running through scenarios that challenged their assumptions and trained new responses. There was laughter sometimes. Learning could be fun. But underneath was a serious commitment to doing better. Regina watched as Thompson led a role-play situation, handling a mock traffic stop with perfect professional courtesy. 3 months ago, she'd been a witness to poor policing. Now she was teaching others how to do it right. Here's something interesting, Regina said, sharing department statistics. Complaints are actually down 40% since we started the new protocols. But civilian compliments have gone up 60%. The numbers told a story of positive change that went beyond just avoiding problems. Near the end of the day, Mrs. Chen, the teacher whose security cameras had captured the original incident, was invited to speak. She shared her perspective as a community member, drawing a few tears from officers as she described how her trust in law enforcement had been restored by the changes she'd seen. Tomorrow, you'll go back to your beats, Regina concluded as the session wound down. You'll face real situations, real pressure, real decisions. But you're not facing them alone anymore. We're a team, and we're all working toward the same goal, serving our community with honor. As officers filed out, many stopped to share quick stories or ask questions. The energy was different from any previous training day. This wasn't just about avoiding mistakes. It was about building something better, something that would last beyond any one incident or individual. The congressional hearing room hummed with anticipation as Regina adjusted her microphone. 6 months had passed since that night on a quiet suburban street, and now she sat before the nation's lawmakers to share what her department had learned and achieved. Cameras flashed as she began her testimony. What happened that night could have ended tragically, she said, her voice clear and steady. Instead, it became a catalyst for change that's spreading across police departments nationwide. In the audience, Officer Thompson sat with several other officers who'd flown in to support the testimony. Their department had become a success story, with police chiefs from across the country visiting to learn from their experience. Our new training program has been adopted by 12 other departments. Regina continued, displaying charts that showed dramatic improvements in police-community relations. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real change is in the daily interactions between officers and citizens. A senator leaned forward, genuinely interested. Can you give us a specific example of how these changes have made a difference? His question opened the door for Regina to share a story that brought the statistics to life. She told them about a recent incident where a young officer had diffused a tense situation using the new protocols. The officer had remembered her training and turned what could have been another confrontation into a moment of understanding. That's the real victory, Regina explained. Not just avoiding problems, but building trust. The police chief from her department sat proudly in the gallery. Their success had earned him speaking engagements across the country, where he shared how embracing change had strengthened, not weakened, his department's effectiveness. 6 months ago, Regina continued, Officer Barrett's actions showed us everything that could go wrong. Today, I'm proud to say his case has become a teaching tool in police academies nationwide. She didn't mention that Barrett had resigned and was now working with anti-bias programs, trying to make amends in his own way. Mrs. Chen's security camera footage played on the hearing room screens, but now it was part of a larger presentation showing how proper training and accountability could prevent similar incidents. The footage had become famous, used in training sessions across the country. The wall of silence that protected bad behavior is coming down, Regina explained. Officers now feel empowered to speak up when they see something wrong. They know they'll be supported for doing the right thing. A young congressional aide passed out copies of the department's new guidelines. now being considered as a model for national police reform. The booklet included quotes from officers and community members, showing how both sides had contributed to the positive changes. But our work isn't finished, Regina said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. This is just the beginning. Every department, every officer, every community has a role to play in building a better future for law enforcement. In the back of the room, journalists frantically took notes. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. It was a roadmap for real change, backed by concrete results and measurable improvements. The night officer Barrett pulled me over. Regina concluded, he saw me as a threat because of his own biases. Today, officers in our department see everyone as members of the community they're sworn to protect and serve. That's the transformation we need across our nation. As the hearing ended, Regina was surrounded by lawmakers and police officials eager to learn more. But her mind went back to that quiet suburban street, where a moment of confrontation had sparked a movement for change. Officer Thompson approached with a smile, now wearing the stripes of a newly promoted sergeant. "You know what's amazing?" she said quietly. "That street where it all happened. We hardly get any calls there anymore. People trust us now. They wave when we drive by." Regina nodded, knowing that real change happened one street, one officer, one department at a time. As she gathered her papers to leave, she could see the ripples of that night still spreading, touching more lives and departments with each passing day.